My goal is to talk about what I think are 7 major discoveries over the last 64 years that changed our thinking in major ways, or should have. But in any case, about one a decade, and that's a slow pace. But each one of these, despite the slow pace, took a long time to digest, and some of these discoveries have not yet been fully assimilated, not yet, in my mind, fully digested as to their implications, let alone accepted. So there was lots of skepticism about these discoveries. There was lots of arguments. I'm going to spare you the details. I'm not going to tell you history. This is not a storytelling session. Instead, I'm going to focus on what it looked like when the dust settled at each of these points. And what's interesting to me about it is that these discoveries, they're so unexpected. They're not based on any theories. They're not always the work of dream researchers or psychologists. They are often accidents or byproducts. But they all happened in controlled research kind of settings, scientific settings, by people who have been trained in physiology, medicine, or psychology. They were not just out of the blue. But I do say they're surprises. And if they're surprises, why? Well, because the mindset we had, those of us that started out in the 1950s. And so, in the 50s, what was it like? What was in the air? What was, in the word American psychologists use, what was the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time? I call the view, generally speaking, psychodynamic. The focus was on motivation, on psychic conflict, on wishes and fears, on the unconscious. It was the realm, as you can tell, of Freud and Jung, and the Neo-Freudians, and in the Neo-Freudians particularly a man named Erich Fromm, who had written a book called The Forgotten Language, which brings forth the whole idea of symbolism and metaphor. It was a world of symbolism, a world of what we today would call metaphor and figurative thinking. And it's important to say at the outset that one or more of these theorists did motivate many of the people, not all the people, but many of the people who went on into dream research and made some of these discoveries. And so whatever we may say, the most important thing that perhaps Freud, Jung, and Fromm did was to make dreams important, to make dreams something that were a subject of study by those who were trying to do systematic work. Now, the first of these discoveries, of course, was by physiologists who weren't looking at all for something about dreams. They discovered by accident in 1953 that there are periodic eye movements during sleep. They thought about that, these rapid eye movements, and they thought, well, it could be related to dreaming. And they did a little study published in '53 that gave us for the first time an objective, observable indicator of dreaming, because they awakened people and lo and behold, they were dreaming. And that discovery, that accidental discovery, of course, put dreams on the map as far as scientific researchers who want to see an observable indicator, who want to be in a lab, and in this case a sleep lab, and the fact that the EEG was so big, gigantic in those days, probably only redounded to our benefit. I mean, we had the biggest machine in the world when we were studying dreams. And lo, within 2 or 3 years, a medical student turned physiologist who turned out to be a closet Freudian, had gone to medical school because he had read the interpretation of dreams 3 times. He got into this field of work, and he tied these eye movements to a sleep stage, an amazing sleep stage, as you know, REM sleep, with all of its physiological changes in addition to these rapid eye movements. And he found it was part of the sleep cycle, that there's REM and non-REM, whereas today we'd say there's sleep onset stage, which is pre-sleep, but it's a definite stage down. There's non-REM 2, and then there's what's called slow wave sleep, which encompasses the other 2 non-REM stages, and we have REM sleep. So we have a whole cycle suddenly to look at. So what are the main outcomes as far as dream researchers concerned of all this research? And it was really massive. There were a dozen or two labs, say from 60 to 75, 80, and then there were a few labs remaining maybe as late as 1990. What came out of this? And that's the occasion then of my first three slides. So if we can see that first slide beyond the title, we see that the important thing, first thing I think is important is we find that dreams do occur during, yes, REM, as the original researchers thought, very frequently, but also in non-REM too, especially late in the sleep period, as we used to call it, which means towards morning. We find dreams upon awakening, whether we're in REM or non-REM. And we find dreams in little patches, little snatches at sleep onset in different stages of this complex sleep onset process, with some of you having dreams almost immediately in that process and some of you a little later in that process. Wide individual differences. And we secondly see then that dreams are more regular, frequent, and long-lasting than anyone imagined, or at least theorized. So recall becomes an interesting point to ponder because we recall so little of this massive dream life. And we still don't know why. And that's an area in which I think some discoveries remain to be made. And certainly there has been zero progress on that issue in any systematic general way. The low correlations that we found in the 60s with dream recall are still being found, such as by Mark Blagrove and Michael Schrenel, still today. And there's two senses in which recall is a mystery. First, that we all recall so little, relatively speaking. And secondly, there are very wide individual differences in recall. And indeed, there's spurts. We might recall dreams for a week or a month, and then all of a sudden we don't remember it. So there's all that mystery around recall. That was quite amazing. And dream content turned out to be surprisingly different, very different than what most people expected. It turned out to be more realistic, often mundane, about things around home, interaction with friends and relatives. It was less bizarre, according to lab studies, less sexual, no large amounts of obvious symbolism, and we were looking. We were often motivated, including me, by these psychodynamic kinds of views. It's also difficult, if not impossible, to cause a dream or to even influence them. So we can't be as experimental as is the gold standard in psychology. We can't manipulate a variable and get an outcome. They happen. They happen to us. So we then want to ask ourselves, and that may be on my second slide. Let's put that second slide up there. You did, good. And thirdly, I want to turn in, what are the implications of all these findings, which is the topic of the next slide. And I think these implications are major, as I said, when the dust had settled, because dreaming is not tied, I'm making this generalization, it's not tied to any one brain state, not tied to any one brain state, which you'll see what I mean when I come to the end of my remark. So there's one necessity, I claim, for dreaming, and it's simply an adequate level of brain activation. An adequate level of brain activation. And the contrast here, key point, is that there are few or no dreams in what is now called slow wave sleep. So it's sleep onset, in non-REM 2, in REM, right at morning awakening, we have dreams. And these are all a little somewhat different. It's also major that dreams are imaginative. They're so, each one of them is different and original, but they are, as I said, largely realistic largely about people, other people we know, and about our interests. There are things in everyday life. And as we will see that, again, in more detail in just a minute. So today we say, in psychology, dreams are simulations. In our mind's eye, I ask you to look at your living room, in your mind's eye. And you can see your living room, and if I could ask you to then count the windows in your living room, you'd kind of go around. Oh yeah, there's that one, that one, that one. And I can say, put the furniture in there. Now, just think of your last interaction in your living room. Oh yeah, I was sitting with these friends and so on. You can call up, you can imagine, you can simulate, you can create that scene once again. And so psychologists talk frequently about simulations. So this concept of simulation is something to keep in mind for later in my remarks here tonight, in terms of some other unexpected kinds of studies. Well, I turn now to the second, what I think, major discovery, and that is a lot of findings on the systematic findings on dream content, based upon collecting large samples of dreams from everyday people inside and outside of laboratories, including sometimes people who slept in the laboratory and then also contributed dreams that they wrote down outside the laboratory, usually at home. And these large collections of dreams, which number into the thousands, have been studied with various methods of quantitative methods, we would call them, which involve specific categories on the one hand and rating scales on the other. And we're basically, all of us, using those kinds of methods if we're doing content analysis. Most frequently, of course, at least in my case, but generally and across the world, but not always by any means, we're referring to the Hall and Van de Kessel categories, which were first developed in a rudimentary form by Hall in the 50s. And then Hall and Van de Kessel, I want to remind you, spent 2 full years trying to get those categories so they would work in terms of reliability, and that they had everything accounted for in a dream. They also put them together knowing there were computers, consulting with IBM people, and so they were remarkably adaptable to spreadsheets. And so when my research assistant, Adam Schneider, that many of you know of, and had been so important in all of my work in the last 23 years, when he made a spreadsheet and put the Hall Van de Kessel system on it, he said, this is nearly perfect in terms of how these spreadsheets work. And then I remembered that they had consulted with these IBM people. So it's a very rigorous kind of system, and most of the results I will mention, it comes from it. But I want to stress to you, even though it's been used in Japan, India, Europe, Iran, Canada, the United States, it's not the most frequently used system by any means. And there are dozens and dozens of other systems that have been developed and continue to be developed. So my focus is on Hall Van de Kessel because it was the one I learned, because it's been used by more than researchers in just one lab. What are the findings? Well, a lot of similarities in dreams in the following way. Gender similarities and differences, age similarities and differences that seem pretty systematic, massive individual differences, as you'll see if you have a lot of dreams from one person. I'm just going to use one example here, and that's the example of gender similarities and differences that are seen partly on the next slide. Now, this slide is based on 500 women's dreams from 100 women and 500 men's dreams from 100 men, collected between 1949 and 1951. And those results have been found often, that is, they have been replicated. And I want to tell you honestly and fully, that was a surprise. In the late 60s and early 70s, we were very nervous. These norms are getting out of date. We do believe in culture and its tremendous impact on human beings and national differences and so on. And so what happened was that in the 70s, out of the blue, in the late 70s, a psychologist at the University of Richmond offered Hall dreams he had collected for his own reasons from his students, men and women. And one of our great students helped us code those dreams, and lo and behold, they matched the norms. That was surprising. And in 1985, somebody many of you know or may remember or have heard of, Veronica Tomei, my former undergraduate student, went to UC Berkeley, and they said, we don't believe those norms, and she had to replicate the norms, and she did with women. We're talking about Berkeley, 1985, wild, crazy, freaking place, right? Those 100 women were right on the norms, blew us away. Asian Americans in that sample, Asian American women, just like the Euro-American women. And there have been others. And the dream, gender, kind of norm dreams are not dissimilar by much in other countries. So they do give us a serious kind of starting point. Let me start with something that's not on the slide. It's made possible by spreadsheets. And that is, we can ask ourselves about the negativity and the positivity of these dreams, as defined as follows. I define a negativity in a dream as an aggression, a misfortune. That's bad things that happen out of the blue through no one's volition. Tree falls on you. You can't find your keys. Failure, negative emotions. Those are negatives in dreams. Positives in dreams: friendliness, good fortune, success, positive emotions. 77 to 80% of the norm dreams have at least one of the negative elements in them. 53% of the dreams, for both men and women exactly, have at least one good, positive element in them. It's quite a contrast. As one of my students put it in a phrase I'll never forget and always use, you know, she said, I think after doing her study, she said, I think dreams are worst case scenarios. But I think for most people, just a whole lot of their dreams are worst case scenario. Now we can be more specific, and that's what's on the slide about similarities and differences. We can see, for instance, at the top, first, let's start in the middle, where we see the rate, the ratio of aggressions to characters. And we see the rate of friendliness to character. How many aggressions are there in your dreams per 100 characters? How many friendlinesses are there in your dreams per 100 characters? They're not that different. And there's other kinds of examples on important issues of where they aren't that different. But there's some that are dramatically different and fairly consistent, it turned out, in many different samples. One we call the male-female percent of all the characters that are named by gender. What percentage of them are males? What percentage of them are females? And to our surprise, no one expected this, no one predicted it. 2/3 roughly of the characters that are gendered in men's dreams are other men. But for women, the figure is more like half and half. And so Calvin Hall called that a ubiquitous sex difference. And I'm still working on all of you to straighten the distinction between ubiquitous and universal. Because something can be ubiquitous and it's not necessarily universal. And the male-female percent is not universal. It's been found to be different in a few samples, and so that makes those samples important if we follow it up, because we say, why are they different? And maybe we'll find a new variable to put into the equation. We also see that men and women differ pretty dramatically on physical aggression percent. What percentage of all their aggressions in their dreams are physical? Men high, women much lower. But if we get to dreams that are kind of rejective and exclusionary, like, no, you can't come with us, or I don't like that dress you're wearing, or this kind of thing, women are much higher on that particular variable. Now, as we see in the next slide, there are patterns cross-culturally, similarities and differences. For instance, there are many of the same findings that I've already said on the male-female percent. But everywhere in the world, with one or two exceptions of samples we have, and that includes ones collected by anthropologists long ago in foraging and pre-industrial agricultural societies, there's more aggression than friendliness, there's more negative emotion than positive emotion, and so on. There's also differences on animal percent. And lo and behold, in these people that I would call, quotes, closer to nature, how many of you have, shot a lion lately? How many of you have run from a cougar? How many of you have been hunting for your dinner? Lo and behold, they have a higher animal percent than we do, and that then raises their physical aggression percent. And we also know that of all the societies that have been studied, Americans have the highest physical aggression percent. Could you imagine that? The society that has the highest murder rate of advanced societies, it also has the most physical aggression in its dreams. There's even a dramatic difference with its very close neighbor, and the best comparison to know how Americans differ, that's with Canada. So, and certainly with all the European samples. Now you may say, oh yeah, okay, cross-cultural similarities and differences. What I want to emphasize to you is there's implication to this. It took us a while to realize, and this gets back to the issue of culture. Why would these dreams be so similar? And I think there's a thing that maybe leads us towards theory, and that is because dreams are so personal. They aren't being maybe powerfully influenced by culture, not because we aren't influenced by culture, but because maybe dream life is exceedingly personal around our concerns. And do people have the same concerns? Born infants, in families, with siblings, fear of death, resentments, and so on. Find that in every society. And you find a lot of that kind of thing in dreams. I want to mention two more major content findings. One is called consistency. And that means you dream the same over months, years, decades. We know that from a couple methods. We know that from studying word strings, as well as from Hall van de Castle coding. And we've done this with 24, I would say, solid kinds of studies. And we see this, one quick example in the next slide. And this is 600 dreams from Jason over about 15 years, divided into 6 categories, 600 dreams, 100, 100, 100, 100. Now, at the very bottom, you see he's constant. He's got a kind of consistency that it's constant, basically, doesn't change on the bottom. And that's his aggression characters ratio with men. Very consistent. But right above that, we see his AC ratio with women. And that's, when we compare that with the men, we have a relative consistency. He always has more aggression in his dreams with women than with men. Very consistently that way. And I can tell you right there, if you know the norms, that's not a typical set of male dreams. Right there. Now, thirdly, in this particular slide, was picked for this reason, there's also a developmental kind of consistency. And that is, you notice from about the third Roman numeral there, starting the third 100 or so, fourth 100, his AC ratio with his wife and daughter begins to rise slowly. And by the 5th and 6th sets, it's shooting up. So as his dreams unfold over 15 years, he's arguing and fighting more with his daughter and his wife. Now that doesn't mean he's a brute of a so on. It's all verbal, and they certainly pick on him plenty. So I didn't tell you the direction of the digression, but believe me, he's not just somehow chastising them. So I'm pretty confident in the idea of consistency. And we began to wonder, when did it start? We had some indications about age 18, but it wasn't firm. It wasn't the kind of things that I would be satisfied with. But now we have some new results. A new unpublished study. We have long dream series from 2 women. They offered them to me when they were in their 20s, late 20s, 5 years apart. They are 6 years apart in their dates of birth. They live on 2 different continents. They do not know each other. They are in no way interested in any dream theory. And they read about the dream bank, and they wrote me and said, would these be of any use? And so I can tell you these 2 different people, hundreds and hundreds of dreams, thousands in the case of the other. I have their dreams from age 13 to 25. And there's consistency of those characters from age 13, 14. It's parents, it's siblings, it's best friends. But their interests could not be more different in this whole wide world, but there they are, from 13 to 25 for both of them. So I think consistency, once we're full dreamers, I think they are consistent in what we dream about. We all have a set of things we dream about. Now, there's another final major finding with the content analysis. And that is a correspondence between waking personal concerns, whether positive or negative, and dream content. And of course, as you know, I think that we dream that there is what we call continuity, or Hall calls continuity, between our thoughts, concerns in dreaming and in waking. He came to this conclusion based upon his studies of these dream series, when he could actually interact with the person, usually, in fact almost always, totally with him, through correspondence after he had analyzed the dreams and sent them a set of inferences. In a couple of cases, he used some of their written records as well. So I think there is this something called continuity that links our conceptions and concerns, as Hall and cognitive psychologists call it, with linked dreams and waking life. Now I want to turn to a third major discovery that in some ways was even more unexpected than the other findings. If this findings came online in the 1980s, and they're developmental findings. They're a work of a person who spent a lifetime in the lab, David Fowkes, a cognitive psychologist, who got into this work in a very neutral kind of way, and he would ask questions that always led to unexpected findings, as you're also going to hear a little bit later. So, for instance, he was one of the people that first found non-REM dreams. He was not looking for non-REM dreams. He was looking for the things that led to what dreams were like, and he found non-REM dreams. In this case, and he told me, but he also said in books, that when he started to study children, he wanted how the content changed, and he was not expecting what he found. And it's a finding that is still resisted. It's always surprising. It doesn't fit any assumption we have. It doesn't come from any theory, and I'm just telling you, it was an accidental finding. Little children do not dream often or well. And now we see on the next slide the results of both, really summarize what he found both longitudinally and cross-sectionally. Let me say, with the youngest kids, it's the same kids over a 6-year period. He saw them every other year. So he saw them at 3 to 5, 5 to 7, and 7 to 9. And then he had another wave, started at 9 to 11, 11 to 13, and 13 to 15. And then he did it again cross-sectionally. He had 80 kids, 20 kids that were 5, 20 kids that were within a month of 6 years old, 20 within a month of 7 years old, 8. Those 4. And he did their dreams. And he got basically the same results. And let's not forget Inga Strauch, the great and wonderful Inga Strauch, who was often at ASD in the past, doing this kind of work at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, whole other country in the 1980s and 1990s, 20 and 30 years after the original work, and importantly, mostly women researchers, where the previous researchers have been mostly male researchers. And in both her adult work and her children's work, she got very similar results to what had been gotten in the American lab. She and David Fowkes are the unsung heroes of laboratory dream research. They have done incredibly important work that's foundational, I think, for our understanding of dreams and for our development of a theory. And so she had a large number of these pre-adolescents. I can't remember my numbers right now because I'm on a roll. And so she had those kids and she studied the 9 to 11 years old and so on. And like Fowkes, she concluded kids have adult-like frequency and complexity of dream at age 9 to 11. So hold on to that for a little bit later. And then she has their findings. Her findings are very similar to his findings. So that then becomes a major kind of finding. Now, as I say, it's been something that people have not been crazy about. So I want to tell you a new little finding or angle if you might want to rethink anything on the basis of what I've said tonight. In the last 2 years, I've delved into the developmental psychology research literature. And this is awakening studies by people, great researchers, experimentalists, who know nothing about dreams. They know zero about dreams. There's nothing in their books about dreams. I have a great set of developmental psychology colleagues. They know nothing about this work by David Fowkes. Zero. And these findings come from all over the country. They don't come from Santa Cruz. And so on the next slide, it tells you some cognitive capabilities that little children lack. They only develop these capabilities by ages 5 to 7. And so narrative skills, what does that mean? Can you go through an event and can you then tell about it? And so one example that I like, the little children were brought into a lab room. It was a kitchen. And they baked a cake with the experimenter. And then they left and they told their mother. Mother asked, "What did you do?" Could they tell their mother what they did? Well, a narrative is when you can put together two pieces of information in a temporal sequence. We put some flour in a pan and we stuffed it in the oven. That's a temporal sequence. It has these two events. But can they go on to say, and it cooked for 10 minutes, and then we did this, and then we put icing on, and then they can't do that. They can get 2 or 3, and it gradually improves. And there's about 11 steps to this, and we can't do 11 steps until we're 9 or 10. And when Fowkes studied dreams of these children, and he counted the narrative sequences, they only gradually improve in terms of narrative sequences. We assume everybody can imagine, but kids only gradually are able to imagine. And they can't do really good imagination until age 5 or so, when they can all get together and say, "Well, you be mommy." "No, I don't want to be mommy." "Okay, then you be the sister." "Okay, and I'll be the aunt, and you be uncle." "Okay, we're going to do this." They can imagine these roles and play these games that are totally out of their imagination. And then there's the strangest thing of all. And it's been done mostly by a psychologist that you can read popularly, Alison Gopnik at the University of California, Berkeley. And she's written on little children and how they think, op-eds and in books. And she says that basically little children do not have an autobiographical self until they're 5, 6 years old. That is, they know what a zoo is, and they know there's giraffes in the zoo, but they don't really have a memory that the other day we were at the zoo and we saw a giraffe. And part of the way they learn it is the next day you say, remember we were at the zoo? Oh yeah. And did we see a giraffe? Yeah. What did you do? Did you pet it? Oh yeah. And so interactively, these cognitive skills in our social interactions, and we develop an autobiographical self. And finally, how can we do visual imagery? You can all generate visual imagery. If I asked you, as I did before, imagine your living room. You know, imagine some picture. You can do it. But the fancy mental rotation study kind of things that are done with adults, when they're done with these little kids, they can't do them well till 8, 10, 11 years of age. So they're lacking cognitive skills that also are probably necessary for dreaming. So I think that's a third discovery, and it changes a lot of things. Now I want to move to the fourth and fifth major discoveries. They happened in the 1990s. Again, totally unexpected. One of them really not quite by dream researchers. They were interested in waking cognition. And that was the first one that involves the neuroimaging of the brain. Now this was dependent upon the development of new technologies, PET scan and fMRI. And I'm not going to try to go into it or pretend I know in depth. But basically it allows you to track blood flows. And the blood goes where the action is, you know. And so you can trace brain patterns through these technologies. And so somebody said it. I wondered basically what REM sleep looks like, and they said, I wonder what non-REM sleep looks like, and so on. And lo and behold, they found a pretty distinctive network, a REM network. Only part of the brain is reactivated during REM, which nobody really expected, and it was a surprise. And there were certain specific areas. The medial prefrontal, I'll just name them because they're in a couple of minutes, medial prefrontal cortex, temporoparietal junction, temporal lobes, areas in the temporal lobes. Oh, interesting, you know, we didn't know what to do with it fully, but we knew there was a REM network. Now, right at the same time, in fact, before, another study was done, was totally different, totally the same results. This was motivated by Freud and Freudianism, and this is a man named Mark Solms at the University of Cape Town. He's a neuropsychologist to begin with, and he had the brilliant, simple idea, the kind you say, why didn't I think of that, to go into this neurology clinic that's taking in people that are having brain problems. They think, you know, they're having bad headaches or they're flashes, whatever they maybe have, or they've just been in a car accident. And in the intake interview, he basically asked them, before he'd seen any neurological workup, he asked them the question, has your injury affected your dreaming? That's all. Most of them said, huh? 361. 200 of them said, no. Oh, okay, that's all we want to know. And others said, yeah, you know, it's the strangest thing. I don't dream anymore. Few said, you know, I still dream, but I don't see, like I dream my mother, but I don't see her. Visual defects in their dreaming. And a third type was, that's of concern to me here tonight, was they say, you know, I now think I'm dreaming all the time, or I get confused whether I'm dreaming or not. Now he does the workup, you know, with all, and then his study was so ancient, it was late 80s, it was CAT scans, but it's still enough. Same areas, that is, the areas that people said, I'm still dreaming, they were the ones that aren't reactivated during REM. And the areas that were led to these defects were precisely in the REM network. And you're going to see that in the next slide or two. So in the first slide that's now coming up, I think, you are seeing a bunch of X's, aren't you? And those X's are saying, we don't need that to dream. So you don't need your primary visual cortex to dream. Because you're dreaming then by inference with your secondary visual cortex, which is about imagery in good part. You don't need your prefrontal cortex. I sure need mine tonight to make sure I know I'm going over time. I see you're out there. I know, we all got to catch planes in the next 2 days. I remember where I came from. I know what day it is. That's all thanks to our prefrontal cortex. Now, that is not working at night. Now, the next slide then shows you the areas that when they are taking a hit in some way, whether a stroke or an injury from car accident or whatever it may be, these are areas that cause you to lose. If it's in these prefrontal kind of areas, it causes, and one of the far back areas, it causes you to lose dreaming. And if it's, and then if it's in that secondary visual cortex area, right, sort of the back of your head, one step in, that's your secondary visual cortex, and you don't have visual images in dream. I claim we know the neural network for dreaming. That's the neural network for dreaming found through those images in labs and through these lesion studies. And furthermore, for we that want to be psychologists about it, we need those lesion studies because they tell us they're not dreaming. They tell us, I am not dreaming, or I don't see the pictures. That's what we need, is that verbal report to know that we are on the psychological level and not just the neurophysiological kind of a level. Well, I scurry on, believe it or not, picking up speed here, because the next era followed very quickly. No sooner were we assimilating this idea of a neural network for dreaming than there was another totally accidental, serendipitous discovery. These neuroimaging people were now very busily studying all of the old concerns of psychologists on tasks, on how we do things. And so they're showing people red dots and blue dots, and you have to push a button when a certain dot comes up, or when something that's atypical comes up, and so on. And so, but beforehand, you've got the person, you've got to put the electrodes on them, and so on and so forth. So we say, just relax, while we got to finish testing our equipment. But they got the machine turned on. And they start, when they look at their records, they also notice on the pre-game record, so to speak, the pre-experimental record, they notice they're pretty similar on these various people. They check around, and they find that we're just doing nothing. That is, there's no task before us. We're not being bombarded with some stimuli. When our mind drifts, there's a network for that. So now they're studying that, and they look at it, and they say, wow, this is different. Now, of course, you know where it's going, but I'm not going to still tell you. And officially, get a little drama into the picture, right? So the point is, they now start doing studies. This is about 2002, 2003. Now they start to do studies, and they decide, you know what? This is the mind-wandering network. And so one person ended their study in 2007 with the conclusion, our mind wanders when it's not otherwise occupied. And I say, that sounds a lot like a dream. We dream when our mind is not otherwise occupied. So you read some of their generalization about mind wandering and say, oh, they're talking about dreaming. There's another paper in this literature called The Restless Mind. The Restless Mind. Because during mind wandering, it jumps all around. There's all these different topics. Now, John Antrobus, a great psychologist, in the 60s, a cognitive psychologist who studied daydreaming as well as mind-wandering, he had done studies showing to say that your dreams are bizarre because they jump around, does that differentiate dreams from your waking mind? Not during mind-wandering, it doesn't. Your mind jumps all around during mind-wandering. And so, don't tell me that bizarreness can be measured by jumps, because our mind is jumping every minute unless you're really on task. And some of you, right, you've been drifting in and out. You say, oh my God, he's going on and on. So what, oh God, and then thinking about that swimming pool, and then you're back to this. So our minds drift during waking. So if there's anything that ever finish off that criterion for calling a dream bizarre, surely it's the waking control group kind of thing. So they put their results out there. Zeitgeist again, the spirit of the times. Right about 2009 to 2011, 3 different dream researchers noticed that the default network is the REM network. Now what's interesting to me about that, not one of those mind-wandering researchers knew that, because they don't know what we're doing. And we, of course, don't usually know what they're doing. And so there it was. And so these claims started to appear in the literature that the default network encompasses the REM network. So the next slide shows you a picture in that pretty blue color that Adam put on there. That shows you the default, the areas of the brain that encompass the default network. And if I had time and more slides, then I could lay one on the other and show you how well they overlap. And so this then becomes a major kind of network. This is the imagination network. This is the network that has the visual imagery parts in it, and so on, and so forth. Now, one of the things that I then want to say is that I'm now going to tell you about the 7th discovery. And even though I've been going chronologically, I've held out on you. There was a 7th, what turns out to be a major discovery in the 70s by David Fowkes in his lab, and nobody knew what to do with it, including David Fowkes, although he wrote about it. David Fowkes was doing some studies of participants that were going to be in a night study. But he wanted them to really be able to focus on the last thing they were thinking when he said, what's going through your mind? So he brought them into practice during the day, hooked them up to the EEG, put the EMG, the muscle, that tells you when somebody falls asleep, really well. So at any rate, he then put them in a mildly darkened room. And he said, what I'm going to do is every few minutes, I'm going to say, what was going on in your mind? That's all I want you to do is report that, okay? Here's his results on the next slide. 20% of the time, 19%, those people were dreaming. He was not looking for that. It's an accident. He couldn't believe it. He did it twice more. And look at that. If you look at that, he also uses the word mind-wandering. So he says 38% of the time they were fully alert, thinking straight on. But another large percentage of the time, he said they're in what we can only call mind-wandering. Their thoughts were drifting around. And then he had another one where you're really immersed in thought. And then he has dreaming. And in all these studies, about 19 to 20% of these little flashes of dreaming, where they say, I was jumping in the swimming pool, or some ridiculous thing, right? That we don't think of, you don't think you do during waking. But if we let your mind drift long enough, and he knows they're awake, see, that's the luck of it. He had those leads on them in such a way, he knows that none of them fell asleep. And yet he got these dream kinds of results. So that's the other bridge backwards. And I want to then, at this point, bring in another little point. Just as dreaming can occur during waking, on the next slide, you're going to see an example of mind wandering during sleep. And this is a quote from work in a great lab by a great dream researcher named Alan Rechstoff, 1963. And what he says, the non-REM reports that were not dreams seem similar to that large portion of our waking thought, which wanders in seemingly disorganized, drifting, non-directed fashion whenever we are not attending to external stimuli or actively working out a problem or a daydream. So what he said is that there's conditions during sleep when we mind wander, and there's conditions during waking when we dream. And that's what we have to then look at. And I predict to you that with the new imaging technologies, including a new one that I've only learned about recently, which is why it's good to stay in touch with people younger than you are, respond to their emails, interact, you learn about infrared spectroscopy, which is a faster, better, cheaper way to look at your brain. And I predict that somebody is going to do a study in which they have a little cap on for NIRS, and they're going to say, I just want you to relax. We're going to sit here for a few minutes before we start the experiment, or some ruse like that. And they're going to be watching on the screen. And they're going to see certain areas come up, and they're going to say, tell me what's going through your mind. They're going to use Fouts' study. They're going to replicate Fouts with this cheaper machine. $80,000 versus millions. And they are going to find the neural network for dreaming during waking. And that's the perfect time to find it because you're more alert. It doesn't take you 2 minutes to struggle out of sleep and kind of remember what's going on. You're more alert. And so I think that, is the next kind of step. So, and this once again talks about activation, but there is more to it. So what is dreaming? Dreaming is an intensified form of mind wandering. We're more cut off from the sensory world in this state. Secondary visual cortices are augmented. And so we're getting more vivid imagery during this. And dreaming, furthermore, is embodied simulation. Back to that word. What does that mean? First, in studies in which I would have you hypothetically doing certain things like imagining you're running, and will activate parts of the secondary sensory motor cortex, and so on. In other words, it's not just sort of an abstract cognitive computer level, but other parts of secondary parts of the sensory apparatus are activated. And there's a number of waking studies that have been done on that kind of issue. So, and they're also embodied another way. You do experience this as fear. You do experience when you see that lion, when you see two people coming at each other, are they going to fight? And you do have that feeling, and you're tense, and you're confused, and all of that. That's embodied. That's real when that's happening. So dreams are, my definition of dreaming, which comes up on the next slide, is as follows. And I think it makes dreams, like any other state, relatively unique, if not totally unique. Dreams are embodied simulations. It's that sense of being an embodied participant in some event or an observer of that event, usually involving characters, activities, social interaction, that distinguishes dreaming from other forms of thought. When you're seeing, when you're walking, when you're experiencing emotion in dreams, the relevant secondary cortex is active, I said. Not just the areas for, quote, in an abstract way, thinking. In fact, for the kind of thinking we're doing today, it's asleep. I mean, it's the it's the frontoparietal cortex, which supports the central executive network. They're all gone when this network is ascended, when the neural network for dreaming is ascended. So when does dreaming occur? It's not just a level of activation. On the next slide, they're put together, when do you have dreaming? And you'll notice, of course, it doesn't say sleep. It says you have dreaming when you have a mature and intact neural substrate that can support the cognitive process of dreaming. Now that's a qualification that allows for what? It allows for lesions, and it allows for cognitive development in children. Secondly, there does have to be, what I've said before, an adequate level of cortical activation, which is provided not just by one system from the brainstem, it's provided by many systems from the brainstem, plus part of the cortex. So we have multiple arousal systems in human beings. And we're not going to find necessarily all of them. In fact, there's one that is unique to human beings. Thirdly, we see that we have to exclude external stimuli. And we think we know the area of that. It's called the thalamus, and it's a gating system for sensory input. And if it puts up a gate, it's not going to get through and register. Fourthly, you need imagination network, which is a cognitive process. The fifth thing is we have a loss of conscious self-control. And that's when we know, I think we know when that is. It's a hypothesis, but it's when the central executive network, whether because of sleep-inducing neurochemicals or because you're bored, whatever it may be, when that gets less active, the attentional networks also become less active, and then the default network goes up. In other words, these brain networks are constantly changing in their degree of activation and in their interaction pattern. And so there's a certain point when the default network is ascendant and all of the alert networks and so on are down. And so at that point, some other highly visual networks come into play, stronger than they do during mind wandering. So I want to say to you, we dream with an augmented, that means some extra, portions, that means not all, of the default network. Okay, all this presents us with some great possibilities, very liberating. If dreams intensified mind wandering, then our home is in the world of neurocognition of mind wandering. We're in the world of non-directed thought, which is now being studied. And they talk about mind wandering and daydreaming, but I think we have to add the idea of dreaming to that network. So I think new findings have given us a potential home. Now, these things all raise lots of interesting theoretical questions about past theories, about new theories, about adaptation of dreaming. This is obviously not the time. I never planned to talk about it. It would be impossible in any case now that I've talked this long. But I want to mention to you in the next slide a possible place where you can read about these issues. And in this book you will find a presentation in detail of this positive case that I put out, that dreaming is mind-watering based on embodied simulation and located in the default network. So in closing, I would like to say that dream researchers of the world should unite. Dream researchers of the world have a new home. Dream researchers of the world have only the shackles of the past to leave behind. It's time for us to move through the gates of horn and ivory and into the world of neurocognitive, mind-wandering psychology. Thank you very much.